Now this is our final panel of the conference. In a sense, the purpose of our conference, reviving interest in the Midwest as a region, and I'll hand it over to our chair, John Lauk.
Thanks, Joe. Is this mic working? Okay. Once again, I want to say thank you to Joe. I want to say thanks to Gleaves. Is Gleaves in the room? I mean, Gleaves and Ann and Joe have done a masterful job of running this conference. I know it's been a long march, but we've had a pretty steady schedule. So thanks for hanging in there with us. But once again, thanks to Gleaves. It's been wonderfully done. So we thought we would wrap up our conference, which we think is somewhat unprecedented in terms of trying to get people together to talk about the status of Midwestern history and how we revive it or give it additional energy, depending on how you look at it. We thought we'd wrap up with some commentaries from some people who are active in the field or have been active in the field. And probably after short commentaries, kind of open it up and get some comments from you. We want to hear your thoughts on the direction of this conference, the Midwestern History Association, other things we can do in cooperation with the Hauenstein Center and other institutions. So without further ado, our first speaker this afternoon is going to be Catherine Cox. I've gotten to know Catherine over the last couple of years. She's my editor at the University of Iowa Press, and an outstanding one at that, and is always on the lookout for books on the Midwest. So, Dr. Cox.
Thank you. Thank you. If you don't mind, I think I'll just speak from here. I don't have a prepared talk so much as a series of comments that I'd like to share with you. I think the Hauenstein Center folks must be tired of being thanked by now. So, thank you. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to all the speakers for some very stimulating papers and some great questions from those of you here in attendance. I also want to apologize. I actually have to run out a little after 5 o'clock to get to the airport to fly home. So I apologize for not being able to stick around and field questions. My email is on the University of Iowa Press website. I welcome any of you who have book projects or just questions to get in touch with me that way. So my task this afternoon is to talk about publishing in the field of Midwestern history. And those of you who may have been at the OAH a couple weeks ago and came to the Midwestern History Association board meeting may know that there are actually several university presses that publish in this area. And though I would like all of you to consider sending your book proposal to me, I do also understand myself here as being somewhat the unelected representative of university presses who publish in this field. So I want to talk a little bit about the state of scholarly publishing in general, and then I'll talk specifically about what I see as some of the opportunities and perils of publishing specifically in Midwestern history. And I expect at least some of what I have to say about scholarly publishing will be familiar to many of you. Anyone with more than a few years in academia should know that the state of scholarly publishing is dire. It has long been dire, to be honest. The business of creating and selling books about academic subjects has never been well-funded or stable. We are mission-driven, we are not profit-driven. But today, like the newspapers, as we heard from some journalists earlier today, today we have new challenges brought on by the rise of digital technology. And in many ways, it's been a boon to us, has sped up our back-end processes, has made it possible for us to operate much more efficiently. But it has really confounded traditional business models. And we have not figured it out. I don't think the big commercial presses have figured it out yet. We're still in the midst of that transition. Perhaps the most significant difficulty for university presses in particular has been the steep decline in university library budgets for monographs, particularly monographs in the humanities and social sciences. And money that used to buy books now goes to pay for journals databases, and the ever more sophisticated hardware and software that is needed to support digital content. And I don't know anybody who would rather go without that content, but it has put a huge amount of pressure on library budgets. The result for presses has really been a collapse in sales, certainly over the past 10 years, looking back even further, 15 or 20 years. And we are the main providers of academic books. If you wonder why book prices have gone up so much in the past 20 years, it's because we have largely the same production costs, but we're spreading them over many fewer units. We can't print as many because we can't sell as many. And on top of that, much more recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, academic libraries have started switching to these ebook databases. You've probably noticed this at your local library, eBrary and EBSCO and things like that. Because of the complicated way that is used to calculate whether a book has actually been accessed by a reader, the presses earn much less per title than we would if the library just went ahead and bought a print book and put it on the shelf. And part of that, too, is something called patron-driven or demand-driven acquisitions. And this is, again, something you may have encountered, where a library lists titles in its catalog that it doesn't actually own yet. And if enough users click on that link, again, use being calculated in this very complicated way that adds up to less than the price of a print book, if enough people click on that link, the library then buys it. This obviously has great advantages for libraries. They're not spending money on books that nobody will ever look at. But it also diminishes their ability to create a curated collection for a body of users who may not realize today that they need a book, but in 2 years they may, or 5 years. Obviously, for presses, this is a huge problem because it means libraries are simply buying fewer books. Our business model, we exist to publish academic books for academics, as well as other kinds of books. And we are expected to cover the cost of production out of sales. That's our business model, plus or minus a usually very modest subsidy from our universities. If we can't sell enough books, we fail. We close our doors. And that has happened. I think we saw a number of presses in the 1990s close down because they simply couldn't make it work anymore. And because we're part of larger institutions, we're not standalone businesses. Because most presses, though not all, are pretty small players in a large industry. We have very little surplus cash, if any. It's difficult for us to experiment to figure out what's going to work in this new business environment. We are experimenting. I'd be happy to talk to people later via email about some of those experiments, but we're limited in the amount that we can do. And I think you all know that the first type of book that's endangered by this changed business environment is the specialized monograph, the kind of monograph that scholars need to write, want to write. It's crucial for their disciplines. It's also crucial for their careers. Those are all the bad things. And I hope now that I've thoroughly depressed you, let me talk a little bit about the opportunities and the perils of publishing in Midwestern history specifically. Because I do think there are opportunities, and I do think there are ways in which this is a very exciting moment to be in publishing, even in the tiny corner of it that I'm in university press publishing. So one of the premises of this conference is that US historians in general have neglected Midwestern history. That the region doesn't get its due in telling the national story or in telling larger transnational or global histories. And I would like to submit to you, contrary to some things that John has said, that Midwestern university presses have never neglected the history of their own region. And I would say this is also true of the state history journals. Is Marv Bergman still here from the Annals of Iowa? Yep. All of the Midwestern university presses I can think of have published, and many continue to publish local and state histories. Series have come and gone. Some presses have closed. We continue to be under pressure, as I've just outlined. But the commitment has persisted, and it's persisted in those state historical society journals as well. Part of our mission, particularly for public universities, part of our mission is to serve the people of the state as well as the academic community. And a lot of the Midwestern history books that we've published, I think it's very notable to say, are aimed at the general public, not primarily at scholars. And for that reason, as well as their often tightly local focus, they have not had as much influence in the national discussion among professional historians as they might have had. They tend to be very rooted in particular places and particular communities. So one of the things that's very exciting to me about the formation of a Midwestern History Association and the promise of the revitalization of the field is that academic historians can bring this tradition of publishing on Midwestern history a broader perspective, a determination to make the histories of this region, the local, the state, the regional histories, to make them matter to national and transnational histories. That's very exciting. I see a lot of hope in it. I think it's one of the great contributions of this effort to pull together these scattered scholars of Midwestern history. But I'd like to also urge academic historians to learn something from the authors of those more popular histories, to learn something from the people who've continued to publish local and state histories throughout this period, the kind of work that university presses and state historical journals have published. And I think we all know that there's a gap between academic historians on the one hand and historians who tend to write for general audiences, for popular audiences on the other. And I think one of the big promises of regional history, of a self-identified regional history, is the possibility of bridging or leaping or somehow closing that gap and bringing those two missions together, the flourishing of a scholarly discipline and also a discipline that addresses and embraces a popular audience. And I think we can see examples of that in the Southern Historical Association, the Western Historical Association. Some of that bridging has happened, and some of those combined discussions have gone on. We can also see those as cautionary tales. John mentioned earlier, the Western Historical Association at one time was a great meeting ground for historians addressing a popular audience, historians addressing primarily a scholarly audience. That also led to some very overt controversies at conferences and some not so pleasant confrontations among scholars at those meetings. And I think that's a real danger. One benefit of a closed scholarly community is that scholars tend to share a certain set of principles about what constitutes good craft. Even if they disagree about interpretations, they can agree with each other on what the important issues are. Once you open up a field to a much broader audience, once you begin to think about historians as custodians or curators of a larger story that we all share, rather than experts telling other people how to believe, you open up the possibility of much greater disagreements. And I don't have any solution for that. I think that continues to be an important part of practicing a scholarly discipline in a way that's cognizant of the larger communities that we're all part of. But I think it is actually a huge opportunity, and I think it's a very important thing for a regional history association in particular to think about as you try to create a specifically Midwestern history and to assert its value, to think about its public value and the broader audiences that you can speak to and that can speak to you and tell you what might be important to say about their stories and their pasts. And I do think there is an audience for this in the Midwest. It may not be huge. We've talked about the hollowing out of rural areas, but there are still lots of people in the Midwest and people, whether native born or transplant, who care about the history of this region, whether it's a deep history going back thousands of years or a more recent history, say, of refugee resettlement in a new place. I think what I'm calling for is the kind of work that Pam Riney-Kerberg actually called for in her recent piece in the History News Network, a kind of history that blooms where it is planted, that embodies and honors and also challenges the place and the community where it grows, that makes an effort to better that place, not simply to reflect itself as it is. If you can do that, if we all can do that, if you can honor the good faith of the regional university presses who've never given up on Midwestern history, I think we can all flourish despite the kinds of economic and social challenges I've outlined. And so I'd just like to close by saying you've heard buy local, you've heard eat local as ways of saving or restoring local rooted communities. You've heard read local from your local indie bookstore or your library. Well, I would like to encourage you also to write local and publish local. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Our next speaker is Drew Caton. Drew Caton has been a longtime professor of history at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He'll be moving soon to Columbus, Ohio, to take over a chair in the history department at Ohio State University. And we're hoping he puts in a good word over there for us Midwestern historians. But Drew's been very active in the field of history. I think he got his PhD from Brown, from Gordon Wood. Was he your advisor, I assume? And he's been writing a lot in recent years about colonial history. But for us Midwesterners, Drew has written wonderful books about early Ohio, early Indiana, and has edited a couple of collections about Midwestern history. So we're happy to hear from Drew today.
Thank you, John, and thank you all. I will continue the tradition of thanking the Hauenstein Center and John, but I want to also thank the people in this room. I have known some of you for many years, and I have certainly read and cited and summarized much of your work over the past 20 years, and it's a delight to be here with you and a delight to hear all of you talk over the last couple of days. I feel like a little bit of an interloper because I really haven't worked in this field in over 10 years, but as we all know, John is nothing if not persistent, and so I'm here. I said I would talk for a few minutes about reflections on the limited appeal of Midwestern history, so I'm probably going to say a few things that may not go down well, but why not? This comes more out of my experience, I think, in running a couple of conferences on the history of the Midwest 15 years ago and on editing the massive encyclopedia, co-editing the massive encyclopedia of the Midwest with Dick Sisson and Chris Sacker at Ohio State, all of which I'm very, very proud of. I guess what I want to do is to quarrel, rather than quibble, with the fundamental assumption, sorry, John, that there isn't much history written about the Midwest. I think there's quite a lot of it, actually. But I think part of what this conference is about is, while there is a great deal of history written set in the Midwest, prize-winning books, field-changing books, Nature's Metropolis and others, very few of these people actually identify themselves as Midwestern historians. And I think that's a distinction worth pondering. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's something we need to think about. And I think it raises a larger question, which is, why not Midwestern history? That is, why are there so many intelligent, well-trained people writing books and articles set in this region who are uncomfortable with or seem reluctant to identify themselves as historians of the Midwest? Now, I think it goes to a couple of things that you as an organization want to think about. And again, I don't think I speak truth here. I'm just trying to raise a couple of dilemmas that in part come out of my experience. One is the extent to which what you want to do is to form a kind of support network for yourselves, to affirm the kind of history that you write, which I think is vitally important. I believe very strongly in local history. I have written it myself, written a history of my hometown, Marietta, Ohio, written a history of Ohio. I believe very strongly, I do not believe that there's a distinction between local historians and real historians. I don't know what the distinction actually is. I believe local historians are doing some of the best work of all historians in the United States today. But I do believe that there's a dilemma here in terms of where you're going and what kind of audience you're trying to reach. That is, if the goal is to identify a populist intellectual revolt that says the Midwest is neglected, that's what I would call, for lack of a better word, a kind of tribal impulse. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think actually it's a good thing. I participated in it to some extent myself, and I'm happy to continue. But there also seems to be an impulse to get respect from people on the coast and the real historians and all these other people, and to wonder why somehow there isn't more respect for the kind of history that we all identify as the Midwest. And I guess I want to make 2 points about that. One is, I am reminded of my English-German grandmother who was born in Illinois, who married an Anglo-Irishman in Kentucky. And I remember her telling me at one point when I was talking about the fact that I was born in Ohio solely because my mother's obstetrician was in Cincinnati. My family lived in Kentucky. And my father had to drive her across the river to have me born in Cincinnati in Christ Hospital. I am named Andrew because the street they went on was Andrew Street. But my great uncles never let me forget that I was born in Ohio. Even though I lived the first 10 years of my life in Kentucky, I was forever Buckeye boy. And it made me fascinated to some extent with this whole notion of identity because I was from Cincinnati, but really I lived in Kentucky, and I had no sense, of anything about being from Ohio. And later on, I remember when I went to graduate school at Brown, one of them said, "Well, of course you went up east and became one of those elite snobs." Thank you. Because you were born in Ohio. Had you been born in Kentucky, this disaster would never have happened. All right. And my grandmother said to me, I said, I was like 22 years old or something, and I complained to her about it, and she said, "Well, Drew, look, if you want people to listen to you, the first thing you have to do is listen to them. And I would urge you all to do a little bit more of that. That is to do a little less caricaturing of the real historians and the people on the coast. We've heard almost as much mocking of them as we have had quoting of people about the Midwest, wine drinking, so on. When I was at graduate school at Brown, my best friends were from Nebraska, Oklahoma, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. We'd all grown up in the Midwest. I don't know how we suddenly got transformed into something who hated the place or something along those lines. So the first point is to take critics seriously. The second point is to move a little bit beyond the defensive thing. I think if it's important, and this is a question, if it's important to get the kind of conversation you seem to want, you have to make a case that's a positive case. How does knowing something about the history of the Midwest change the history of the United States or change the history of the continent or the globe in a particular kind of way? That is, local history is wonderful. It's great stories. I told you local history stories. But you need to think, we all need to think, I tried to think, about why people beyond those of us in this room who love the Midwest should care about its history. And simply saying we're important and we're ignored is not really an answer. I remember several years ago going to a convention of historians, a large convention. I decided, because I love to teach the introductory survey class, to go and sort of catch up in different fields. And I went to a panel of diplomatic historians, and a panel of women historians, and a panel of political historians. I forget the fourth one. Guess what the theme of every single one of them was? Nobody takes us seriously. We're ignored. They don't teach courses in political history anymore. They don't teach women's. Nobody cares about it. What is interesting to me, in other words, is not that we feel that way, but that the entire culture feels that way. And what does that say? And what can we bring to that kind of conversation? So let me just add a few things here, and then I promise I will shut up, about why I think it's so hard to get historians to think in Midwestern terms. That is not to get them to write Midwestern history. I think they're doing that. But to get them to call it Midwestern history. Part of it, I think, has to do with, whether you want to call it variety or diversity, depending upon your political opinion, the diversity of landscapes, the diversity of people, all the things that you all have so richly talked about in the course of this week. There was a time when I thought about writing a history of the Midwest from the 19th century to the 20th century, and I couldn't figure out any way to organize it, primarily because of the states being so important and being so different from each other. States matter in the Midwest. They matter hugely. I think it's worth saying that, for example, I've written a history of frontier Indiana, and I've written a history of the state of Ohio. The history of the state of Ohio has sold more copies by an X factor of all the rest of the books I've written in my life put together. Now, it wasn't marketed any better. In fact, it was marketed less well than some of the other ones. But there was a market. People wanted to know about Ohio. I think a lot of people are interested in the Midwest, but it's not in the top 2 or 3 parts of their identity. So what does that mean, that state identity is so strong? I think it also goes to the point that the politics matter, and it's been a curious absence in this conference. We haven't heard much about politics at all. States matter, not just state borders, but states matter. You mentioned that I'm moving to Ohio State, and I had a friend of mine come and say, Drew, that was a really smart move, like I had any choice in the matter, right? He said, you're staying in Ohio. And I said, well, why? He said, because the state retirement system in Ohio is safe for 20 years. And he said, if you were moving to Illinois, I would have thought you were really stupid. Well, what does that say? It says governments and states matter. And it varies from place to place. The state of Ohio has pretty much destroyed introductory survey courses by saying that a 3 in the AP gives you a student credit for a course, which they do in order to make college cheaper, but what they're doing is essentially destroying history enrollments at every university across the state. So part of what identity is about, I think, is the relationship. It's impossible to simply study yourself in isolation. Identity is about them as well as us. There's a reason why we identify other people who don't like us, and we talk about this because it's a way of talking about who we are. People often identify ourselves. We're a group together because those people aren't part of us, or those people don't like us. I think traditionally the Midwest has been strong, and I agree with those people who said it was strongest as an identity in the late 19th and early 20th century because of the relationship to the nation. And I guess I say that as the author of a book called The Midwest and the Nation. But that's because the Midwest is seen as a region within the United States. And therefore, its relationship to the government and to national identity is critical. What makes Southern regional history so powerful is the sense of alienation from the government that has been there for more than 150 years. That the South as a region can identify, in part because of a war, that somehow we're not at the center of the American decision. I think Patty Limerick's book about the West makes the same point. The legacy of conquest. We were conquered by the nation. And we still, in the West, suffer the consequences of water shortages and all these other kinds of things, decisions made about land use and everything else. But the Midwest has largely identified with the American government until the last 40 or 50 years. In the late 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, the Midwest was a very powerful voice in the American government. My favorite quotation from an Ohioan, Orville Wright, speaking to a group of New Yorkers in 1911. If you want to be a success in the United States, make sure you get a great mother and be born in Ohio. Now, people wouldn't say that today. But in 1911, it was a very powerful feeling, and I was thinking in large part it had to do with the fact that people felt like somehow the Midwest mattered. I don't think they feel that as much today, and that's part of the reason why there's this kind of tribal regional interest in it. Although it's hard to deny, the Midwest gets a lot of attention. I mean, think of poor Iowa in the next 18 months. Tons of people there, and I'll get calls from reporters all over, about Ohio, swing state. Oh my God, when did this happen? Oh, about 1800. That kind of thing going on along the lines. And I think part of that is the problem that there isn't that sense of alienation. The other, and my big final point, I think, is that, I'll call it real history, although I'm uncomfortable with that. Regional history defined within the nation state is going against the tide of intellectual developments in the academy and history, which is to think beyond the nation state, to think in terms of global connections, to think in terms of water, which is going to be one of the great issues for my grandchild, if not for me, to think in terms of continents, to think in terms of networks of people, not just digital networks, but economic networks, social networks, and other kinds of things. It is, for example, unimaginable to me that anybody will write about this region in 15 years without talking about Canada. You're going to have to talk about it. And the notion that somehow everything stops at the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota or the Great Lakes just strikes me as increasingly outdated. Water is going to be one of the biggest issues, and I have talked for the last several years to Midwestern legislators, a group of them, and every year that's the issue they bring up, water. Michigan has a lot of water, Kansas doesn't. And you can already see them beginning to talk about this and fight about it. But if you're going to deal with water, you're going to have to deal with Canada. So while academic historians are thinking in terms of the Great Lakes, the Mississippi Valley, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, North America, the Pacific Rim, that is seeing nation states as important, but within regions that are not defined by their relationship to the nation state, but by people who build relationships economically, socially, commercially, and in other ways, then part of what's going on, I think, is not just that the idea of the Midwest as a region peaked probably somewhere around World War II, but the very methodology and concept of what we think a region is no longer as viable among academic historians as it was 40, 50 years ago. So again, these are reflections. They're not intended to be encomiums. They're not intended to be truth. And some of you may just think what I said was, terrible, and you certainly have a right to say that. I would just urge two things to repeat myself in summary. One is that if you're going to talk, if you want to figure out a way to get other people to pay attention to you, you have to pay attention to them. Why are they not hearing what I'm saying? Rather than just saying, they don't care, they don't like us, they don't want to do anything, or they don't respect us. And the other, and I think the more important thing is, to say to them, here's what you will get from studying the Midwest that you don't already have. That may be local. It may be local history. But I don't think there's any need to be embarrassed or defensive or to feel guilty about studying the Midwest. It's a terrific, wonderful place. I am so proud and happy to be from this region. And when I was at Brown, we would go out and we'd talk about what it meant to be from Ohio. And we loved being from these places. But I think, and I ended up writing about Ohio, but I think what you have to do then is to wonder why, again, when people tell these stories about set in this region, they choose not to call them Midwestern stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Drew. Our final speaker today is Joe Anderson. Joe grew up in Nebraska, earned his PhD at Iowa State University, and has been teaching for a lot of years, almost 10 years at Mount Royal University up in Canada. Joe wrote a book about the post-World War II Corn Belt a few years ago, and he has a brand new book out, which we review in the new issue of Middle West Review, and it's a book about the post-war Midwest. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the shout out about the book. Appreciate that. It's really hard to follow Drew Caton. Anybody notice that? Yeah, thank you. And first of all, please don't hesitate to recognize that I know how ridiculous it is to talk a little bit about the future of the Midwest, history of the Midwest, and about where we're going. But I do think it's worth offering some reflections, certainly in an informal setting. We know that historians are generally terrible about predicting the future. If we were good at it, we'd probably be day traders, but we're not. Any claim I offer today is a modest one, and it's offered with a strong helping of historical precedent. So I'm going to claim that the future for the study of the history of the Midwest is actually quite good. It is bright, maybe not as bright as it was during the heyday of the prairie historians John described in his book Lost Region, but certainly good. I think it's important to issue a caution, though. The history of the Midwest in the future will not be the same as it was. We've talked a lot today about how time is going to change things. It's not standing still. So future histories will do, and to pick up where Drew was, these histories will be very different kinds of histories. And certainly the move towards transnationalism, towards commodities, towards systems and networks will be part of that. So I do believe that this work will be taken seriously as it has been taken seriously for a long time. I think Catherine rightly points out, Drew rightly points out, that we've seen a lot of great work published about the Midwest. It's only been lost a little bit. I'm quite encouraged to read my minutes from the St. Louis meeting that we have a lot of interest. Truman State's publishing on the Midwest. Of course, University of Iowa's series, Iowa and the Midwest Experience, is absolutely fantastic. Northern Illinois University Press, which I have much love for, is published. Midwest is not their most important publishing area, but they've published some great titles over the last 30 to 40 years. We've certainly, Southern Illinois University Press publishes robustly in the Midwest. And I was surprised to see that Hastings College, my hometown, is looking to develop a press. Who saw that coming? So, the journals, there's great publishing going on in the Midwest. And the development of the Midwest Review is absolutely critical to provide a place for scholars to showcase work on the definition and meaning of the Midwest. It's incalculable for those of us who care about the American Middle. For that journal, other accomplishments, it is worth, again, mentioning the contributions of John. The Lost Region is getting the attention it deserves for reminding historians why the Midwest has mattered. Another reason why I'm optimistic about the future is that I had a chance to join Lisa Ocean and Catherine Cox in serving on the Dorothy Schweiter Committee to award the MHA Prize for the best article on the region. Many submissions, all of which were very high quality, of very high quality. And that didn't surprise me, and I don't think it surprised you either. Nor was it surprising that most of those entries were studies of Midwestern people, places, or institutions. That is to say that they were set in the Midwest. But what really caught my attention and Catherine's attention, and I think Lisa's too, why we ended up going the direction we did, is that many of these essays used the Midwest as a lens for making sense of those people, places, and institutions. The distinction is an important one, and it kind of gets to where Drew's critique was a little bit ago, maybe halfway where you were going, that the Midwest is more than a backdrop or a stage. Rather, it's central to understanding what actually happened. And I think if you can make the case, like our best articles that we reviewed for the Schweiter Prize did, I think that's where we're going to see the future history of the Midwest going. You catch the distinction, not a stage, but for helping us understand the relationships, as Drew described, not only amongst Midwesterners, but with the nation, transnational setting in terms of systems. I think this is really exciting. And what's especially exciting is that so many people rose to the challenge. So many people wanted to do that. The work that we've seen here over the last 2 days provides some important ground for optimism too. And while we've just had a quick view of some of the author's research, I look forward to seeing a lot of it in print. One, perhaps last thing, we've discussed nostalgia, and it's come up in multiple ways, multiple times. And I really appreciated, I believe it's James, is that right? Your comment about a critical nostalgia, right, that differentiates it from simply that longing for something that was or longing for a place you've left behind. I really do believe that nostalgia can be our friend if used with caution. Whether or not the Midwest is lost, disappeared, found, the fact that there's nostalgia about it, and I spoke about Garrison Keillor's kind of ambivalence earlier today about how I think he's moved, if possible, towards a more nostalgic view in the 21st century than in the 20th century. What it means is there's an audience. That because there is a longing, it means that people care. And Joe Amato's comment today about honoring ancestors, I don't know if Joe is here right now, but one of those things that really resonated with me is that people live as long as you remember them. And that's the historian's job. And I think, again, people, our audience may come to us with nostalgia. And that's okay, because our job as teachers and public historians and scholars is to meet people where they are. But what we can do, what we're uniquely positioned to do, is to puncture nostalgia, rough it up, get the sandpaper out, and to be able to provide like Jim said earlier, a critical nostalgia. I think that's a real opening for us. It's a great opportunity for historians and scholars of the Midwest generally. I'll give you one quick example. When Northern Illinois University Press published my first book, Industrializing the Corn Belt, out there on the table, we were careful about the jacket selection. And if you saw it out there, you saw that there's an international tractor on there, beautiful red tractor in a cornfield. And what I suspected might happen actually did happen. I don't know if you guys ever get fan mail about books. Sometimes horrifying, sometimes exciting. Hands down, the best piece of fan mail I got about industrializing the Corn Belt was from a guy in southeast Nebraska. And he wrote me an extremely long, extremely well-informed letter about my book. Even caught an important error on page 184. Sorry to report that. But what he wrote was, he said, I bought your book because I loved the jacket. We don't all have the benefit of putting a Farmall M on the cover of your book, on the jacket. But having bought the book because of that tractor, this layman, a farmer from southeast Nebraska, proceeded to give not only a great critique of the book, a critique that could be in any journal, but then proceeded to provide personal reflections about his experiences during the post-war period of agriculture. It was just such a thrill to read it, but it did serve as a reminder, and as I was preparing for today, the way that the longing for that Farmall M and the way it smelled, the way it sounded, the way it moved through the corn, and you can hear the corn slapping up against the side of that machine, that nostalgia can be our friend. Not always, but I encourage us to take it seriously. Sometimes evidence for the interest and vibrancy for the study of a region turns up in very strange places. Just this spring, I joined a PhD committee for a student at the University of Calgary. I will repeat it, the University of Calgary, who's researching a dissertation topic set in the 19th century Old Northwest. It's exciting to see people at the beginning of their careers who are considering what the Midwest means. And that first meeting was just a great example of what a dissertation committee meeting can be. We're pushing them hard. What does the Midwest mean? Why does it matter that you're studying Indiana? And it was exciting to see the students start to grapple with some of these questions. I was really encouraged, by the way. And Nicole, he's going to be talking to you soon if he hasn't already. Now, I ask you, am I deluded that the future of the history of the Midwest is bright? Doubters may walk away unconvinced. You're welcome to do it. Perhaps you're simply convinced that I'm a glass half full kind of guy. But to me, the evidence here and beyond indicates that really positive things are happening. And they're happening at a scale that will inspire new and emerging scholars to pursue their interests, to pursue them in new ways, and explain to fellow academics and the public what has been at stake here and why it matters. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Well, we really want to hear from you and keep the conversation going and get some interaction going here in a minute, but I'll offer a couple of comments, a couple of responses. First of all, on this question of, is the field of Midwestern history robust or strong, or is it declining? Has it been lost, et cetera? I just want to clarify a couple of things. I never said that the field had vanished. I didn't say there was zero activity. My argument was that the activity had declined very dramatically. And I cite these examples: the disappearance of 5 regional journals, the disappearance of these regional book publishers that focused on the Midwest, the absence of big books. I mean, Drew mentions Nature's Metropolis, which is great, but that's 25 years ago, and there wasn't much before it or that much after it. Now, I'm not saying there was zero production of Midwestern history. I'm just saying it was quite low, and there wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm to go into the field. As Drew said, people were hesitant to identify as Midwestern historians and take on big projects about the Midwest because there's always this fear, who's going to publish it? Will there be an audience for it? Catherine says that university presses are much, much more conscious of the economics of these things. And so you have to take that into consideration too. When you're ultimately going to have to make the pitch to a publisher, here's my book, you should publish it, and they're going to go in the back room and scratch their head and do the bean counting, and they're going to be like, well, maybe there's not the audience for this. Maybe there's not a field created for this, which will, create a couple of hundred purchasers of the book. So people have to keep that in mind. But I never said there was zero. I said it was really bad, dire situation, and we needed to sort of goose the field a little bit and bring it back to life somewhat. And that's kind of been the goal with the new journal. And more and more book publishers are talking to me, and they're saying, hey, we want to start a series on the Midwest. This is a good idea. Maybe we'll start a press focused just on the Midwest. Maybe we should have a second journal about Midwestern history, because those are all good things. And on the question of the journals, keep in mind that my argument was regional journals had declined. There are state journals, of course, and I think one of the flagships is the Annals of Iowa. It's a great journal that publishes great articles about Iowa. But what we want people to do is think a little bit more regionally and think outside those state boundaries. They're very important entities. I agree with Drew. People are conscious of these things, but we want to move beyond that a little bit. Now to a couple of Drew's points here. Well, no, I'm going to go to the nostalgia point now. This nostalgia thing, I'm sort of frustrated with this. I like what Joe said about it, and there's been some other comments here about this, but one of the things that I do hear in this whole discussion about Midwestern history and where is it and should it be revived, I'm probably the number one attack on this idea is, oh, that's just, rosy pictured, nostalgic kind of history. Well, that's a real blunt dismissal of the field, I think, and I think we should push back against that as Midwestern historians. I mean, think about, for example, our press panel here. Think about what Monica Davies said. I mean, she's a very sophisticated analyst. She's a New York Times reporter, very, very smart. And what did she say? Her point was, yeah, the Midwest is different, and it's pretty nice. And so if someone does a lot of research and comes up with some conclusions and says, the Midwest is pretty good on these counts, we shouldn't shy away from making that bold conclusion. Same way with Ben Kessling was talking about covering the Somali immigrants into Minneapolis. And he said, I remember seeing his story in the Wall Street Journal. And several of these folks said, well, if I'm going to be an immigrant in the United States, there's no better place than Minnesota, because and that has to do with identity and history and region. And so I kind of get frustrated with this sort of coasty put down based on nostalgia. Now, I think the way Jim has described it and Joe's described it is a good way to look at it, but I don't think we should shy away from the fact that some good things happened in the region. One last comment, and this relates to what Joe says about drilling this poor doctoral student up there in Calgary about what is the Midwest. I mean, this always comes up. If you do a radio interview and you're talking about the Midwest, one of the first things is, well, what is it? And when I interviewed Garrison Keillor for that thing in Salmagundi, we had this hour-long exchange about whether or not Ohio was in the Midwest. I could have used Drew there because he was very obsessed with the question of Ohio.
Well, there are two of us.
But this is a good topic. I think we should debate it. It's a great way to generate discussion in classes and draw younger students into the whole field. What is the Midwest? I find it interesting, but you can't let it become a barrier to launching into doing projects on the Midwest. Just know from the beginning, the Midwest is messy. It doesn't have tidy borders. Half of South Dakota's in, half of it isn't. Half of Missouri's in, half of it isn't. It's always going to be that way, but don't let it be a barrier to doing scholarship of it. Embrace the complexity of it. Remember Colin Woodard's great maps up here of these migration streams and places like Ohio, which have a very complex ethno-cultural composition. That's a great thing. That's a fun part about studying the Midwest is how diverse it is and how complex it is and how fuzzy the boundaries are. Those are all great topics for future books and articles, and this is grist for the field. It'll keep us going. So that's enough out of me. Let's hear from you. Let's have some questions. Jim, you start us off.
Well, can I just respond to that?
If there's one rule I have is no Canadians.
I think
No,
it's,
I'm kidding.
I think
Joe.
it's
We
worth,
love them.
I think it's worth pointing out that I said I've been talking to this group of Midwestern legislators for the last 4 summers in Madison. Canadians are there. And they're there because the politicians realize you have to deal with Canada. I think corporations realize that. I think it hasn't seeped into the popular culture as much, but I endorse you. To your first point, I totally agree. And I think one of the things where John and I disagree is I think that there's an enormous amount of Midwestern history published these days, but it's published in the Journal of American History. It's published in the William and Mary Quarterly. It's published in the Journal of the Early Republic. It's published in Civil War history because it speaks not just to the Midwestern experience, but to the national experience and the international experience. Classic example, I used Nature's Metropolis was a stupid example because it was dated. But let's take Native American history. In my part of the world, 18th and early 19th century, from Richard White's Middle Ground in the 1990s up to Bethel Saylor has just published this wonderful new book called The Settler's Empire on Wisconsin in the early 19th century. Matthew Salafia has a book from Penn Press on the Ohio River Valley and labor systems. Christopher Phillips is publishing a book with Oxford University Press on the Ohio River Valley as a middle ground between the Midwest. You think the most important work in Native history, at least in early American history, has been centered in the Great Lakes. But those people do not say, I'm writing Midwestern history. And that's a problem. Well, my point is, though, that you've got to be careful about there's a distinction between, there's a lot of work set in the region, but if the issue is they want to do what I and Susan Gray and others tried to do 15 years ago, and John I'm nobly trying to do now, which is to think about the Midwest as a definable region, those are 2 different enterprises. And where John and I disagree is, I think the second one he's right about. I don't think there are many people right now working on the question of the Midwest as a region. But I disagree strongly that there's not a fluorescence of scholarship on everything from Ohio to the Dakotas, but as you said, much of it is linked into other, discourse communities, talking about transnational commodities. It's just Midwestern is not the way they frame the problem.
I think we agree. I recognize that there are these good books, but they're just not put into sort of a category of Midwest, so it doesn't really, doesn't count in some ways, but it's very important work being done. Yes, sir. What's that?
You have to learn to look to your right. There was a previous leader who was always looking to the left.
I'm lost.
I'm not sure.
Looking at it from 2 angles. Number 1, the production angle, and number 2, the reception angle. And to start with the second one first, Drew Kate, it's really nice to talk about publishing in the Journal of American History, Oxford University Press, some of these other places. Guys like you have been very successful doing it. I have tried, but it's always helpful to maybe call this a second rung or third rung. We have to have other places where we can do this, and so that's part of the issue. But from several states, and that's a wonderful thing, but you need to have a possibility of taking a smaller geographical area than the nation and larger than a single state. You know, it's just a very practical problem of cutting the geography up, being able to do something practically within the space you have available and the time you have available.
Lem-
Research, and that's just a practical methodological issue to look at things sectionally.
Yeah, let me comment on that real quickly, and I think this speaks to my point about, focusing on the region and getting people to think outside of state boundaries and et cetera. So we just published our new journal of, our new Middle West Review journal, and the cover story is about an African-American woman named Emma Bell Thompson, and she grew up in North Dakota, ended up in Chicago. It's a very interesting story. And this fellow wrote this article about her, and he had been shopping it around for about 10 years. And he most recently had it rejected because an African-American history journal wrote back to him and said, well, this is kind of interesting, but can you take all this stuff out about regionalism? We don't care about what she thought about North Dakota and Chicago and all these intra-regional comparisons. But that's what made the story so interesting, is that she grew up in North Dakota, ended up in Chicago. She could compare the two places, talk about, different parts of the Midwest. But he would not have had a place to publish that article if it wasn't for the Middle West Review, which is very interested in focusing on things relating to region and wants to promote regional consciousness. David. David Good was chairman of the history department at the University of Minnesota, and he mentioned going through all the resumes when they were hiring professors, et cetera. David, how many big meetings did you have at the University of Minnesota history department where you discussed hiring Midwestern historians?
Well, we never talked about hiring Southern historians, or generally speaking, just the region itself is not an issue. If colonial history, okay, sure. But colonial history then is going to be done.
Well, there's also a practical problem anymore in that history departments are shrinking. My history department in Ohio, the one I'm leaving, is used to have 29 faculty members. We're down to 16. Now, Midwestern history is important, and I want to reiterate that. Don't anybody hear me saying it's not. I think the Middle West Review is a great thing. I think we need to have those kind of publications. But I think part of the reason that we need a broader perspective is to understand that if there's not Midwestern history taught at some places, it may not be because people have an animus against Midwestern history. It may be that you only have 2 hirings to do, and you have to cover the world. And so you have to make decisions about hiring that are very different from the kind that you would have made 15 or 20 years ago. And I mean, it's this, I was joking with Annette Atkins earlier because I was thinking about this when I wrote the history of Ohio, and I went around the state signing copies and talking courthouses and everything else, and people were very excited. First thing everybody does is to open the index and look for their hometown. And if their hometown wasn't in it, I had to justify why it wasn't there. And they would tell me, this town is so important because my great-great-grandfather led a regiment and was wounded at Shiloh. And you can't say to that person, look, I'm really delighted to hear that, and it's a great story, and I'm glad that you and your relatives and friends care about it, and it's vitally important to you, but it's one of the 1,000 stories. And that's what I'm trying to say about, you can write about a local place. John McFarrager's Sugar Creek is about a little township in Illinois. But yet it's used in survey courses, all over the United States, because it spoke to issues that were about more than the Illinois prairie. My favorite novelist ever, William Faulkner, wrote about maybe 10 square miles. And yet he wrote books that people all over the world can relate to. I think you can write about the Midwest as a region, and I hope people do, and you can certainly write local history. But unless you focus it or frame it in some way that it speaks to larger issues, whether they're intellectual or emotional or whatever, you're only talking to yourself.
I was talking to a person in a large Midwestern history department a couple weeks ago, and he was telling me, he said, well, I really like what you're doing and stuff, but let me tell you, if I brought up the idea of hiring a Midwestern historian, I'd be sort of laughed out of the faculty meeting. And then he said, by the way, we are about to hire our 4th person to teach Southwestern borderlands history. And he's like, we don't need another Southwestern borderlands historian. We've got that covered. And he's supportive of it. But he just thought that if he brought it up, it would go over like a lead balloon. Okay, Mike's had his hand up.
At the risk of making overgeneralizations, or should I say gross overgeneralizations,
What other kind are there?
That's right.
I think the other panel has 2 different visions for the movement, for the future of our movement. I think one was more popular, more appealing to a popular audience, an educated popular audience. And then on the other hand, we heard about the necessity of gaining the respect of the historical establishment, one that thinks globally and not tribally. I would say, and that's a generalization about the discussion we had. I think, really if there's a choice to be made, I think we go towards the direction of the educated popular audience. And just one note, when you think about who's the most influential American historian today, I mean, seriously.
David McCullough?
Yeah, hands down.
Ken Burns.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And a great Midwestern, incidentally, from Wisconsin, who weaves Midwestern themes throughout all, or nearly, 3/4 his movie. And also someone who is not real well received by the historical establishment. And I say, let's go the Ken Burns route.
Just a quick response. I absolutely think it's a critical part of relevance in the future, especially as departments are shrinking, budgets are shrinking. There's concern, but we don't have to pick. We can do both things.
Well, and at the risk of sounding defensive, I wasn't trying to say one or the other. I was saying what I was hearing in the conference was a desire to do what you do and be proud of it, but also it wasn't me. It was coming from speaker after speaker after speaker who's invoking, well, the real historians don't care about what we're doing. If you want to go the Ken Burns route, more power to you. I'm all aboard. But then drop the constant reframe about, who cares? In other words, there's a kind of underlying anxiety that runs through the whole thing that says somehow it's not enough to simply do what you do because somehow the bi-coastal establishment's not paying attention. Who cares? That's what I'm trying to say, is I'm not sure that it's productive to continue a conversation that exchanges caricatures. Just make your case, do your history, and write it and be proud of it and get it out there, and hopefully some people will read it and pay attention to you. And don't worry about whether the Yale faculty wants to, hire people or not.
Don't you think that would be the ultimate? I mean, I interviewed Howard Lamar a few years ago for an article about him, and he told me the story about when Yale hired their first Western historian in 1952. And he said this was a major turning point for, intellectual history, the history profession, because the Yaleys recognized that the history of the American West was a legitimate field. Mm-hmm. And it was important, and it should be on the map of historiography. And from that point forward, it started to grow. The Western History Association took off, and it became a much more serious field of study. So whether or not this happens, and we don't really need to worry too much about whether it happens, but if somewhere down the road, Yale says, there's a big section of the country we don't cover very well, and they hire a Midwestern historian, then that will be an indicator that, the field is successful, it's grown, it's legitimate, et cetera.
My only caution there is to echo what I said before, that the new Midwestern history will not look like the old.
Yes.
And my caution there is that that's taking the old model of the days of plenty and projecting it into the future. And I don't think that's going to happen. So I think the new Midwestern history will actually look quite differently. It will become embedded in universities
Let me just give you
in
an
a different
example
way.
of that quickly. We hired 2 young historians this year because we were finally allowed to hire after 7 years and 15 retirements. And one of the people we hired was a Yale PhD who's writing about the Southwest borderlands in the late 1970s.
Of course.
So I get to take him to lunch, and he says to me, my next project's going to be about Iowa. And I
I
said,
love this person already.
yeah, but what does he want to write about? How do those two things link up with each other? He wants to write about Hispanic migrants and borderland cultures in Iowa and about the commodification of labor and race. Now, that goes to your point. He's really eager to write about Iowa. He believes in that. He's all for it. He's going to do Midwestern history. But it's not going to be the kind of Midwestern history that I did 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
So maybe we
Mike.
could have a new Midwestern history like the new Western history that occurred 20 years ago, and we could focus on these connections. Think about Borderland and Wilson in Chicago and
Yeah.
people working in the meatpacking places, and also link it into an international perspective with the local and the global.
Right.
You know, I think we've been talking about this, circuits that connect the region to the global stage.
It's creative.
And the urban
Yep.
setting.
Yep.
We need to focus on that.
Just a quick example, Christian Hogenson just did that quite beautifully in Journal of American History with Meet in the Middle. That really explores a lot of that, and I think she did it really well.
Well, I also decided years ago, for what it's worth, I was going to write articles for historians and books for people. And so I mean, literally decided that. So the Indiana book and the Ohio book and other things I've done were just, I wrote to my sister who never finished college. That was my audience. But an article I write to argue with other historians. That's a model that's worked for me, and I think might be one we're thinking about. Because I agree, you can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
I think understanding the boundaries to connect it to other regions and to a global setting. And I don't know how we make it a Ken Burns sort of thing as well. Can we do that?
Well, I mean, it goes back to the point I was trying to make, not very well, obviously, which is there actually an audience there? You know, is it that there's sort of lying out there in wait, a whole lot of people are just dying for Midwestern history? Or is being Midwestern kind of like in the sort of top 10 words that people describe themselves, but not necessarily in the top 2 or 3? One of the things that was really interesting to me about this conference was a lot of people told Midwestern stories. And at least on 3 occasions I can remember somebody said, well, what was Midwestern about your story? And on all 3 occasions, they couldn't answer the question. And I think that's a dilemma. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, the Midwest matters and it's important, and, you know, who in this room disagrees with that? We wouldn't have spent the last 2 days of our lives if we didn't. I agree with that. But when you get down to, I mean, that's what Susan Gray and I ended up in our book deciding was, what is the Midwest? It's the stories people tell about place over time. And there are a multitude of stories. And you celebrate them. You embrace the diversity. And that's fine. But it makes it very hard to say, I'm going to teach a course in the history of the Midwest. If you're teaching a course in the history of the South, start with slavery or, you know, the Civil War or something like that. But the Midwest, well, let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yes, sir. I'm not really sure we disagree on
We're
something.
Midwesterners, John. We don't want to disagree. Common ground is our middle. That's right.
Yes, it is about time for that. But I think Drew's point is, let's just launch ahead, write these books. We know there's interesting stories in the region. Let's tell them. I completely agree with that. I think where there may be a little divergence between us is that I am hopeful that we could carve out a little space or elbow room in the profession that gives us a little bit more recognition. And your position is, who cares? You don't even need that. Let's just do it anyway.
Well, that's part of it, but my larger position is that the entire profession of academic historians in this country is under attack. and resources are shrinking and positions are shrinking, and it's very hard to make a case for anything. Like, hey guys, why don't you have a historian of this? I don't care what it is,
Yeah.
Midwest,
Diplomatic.
whatever it might be, when you're 2/3 of what you were, when history departments in Ohio, Toledo, and Bowling Green and others are practically evaporating. You just want people who can cover the survey courses.
Right.
And I think one of the things we haven't talked about this week is that kind of crisis in the academy. I think the kind of thing you're calling for would have been easier financially to have accomplished 50 years ago.
Right.
But now, look, I'm retiring. I'm moving to Ohio State. My wife is retiring. Miami University's history department, except for these people we hired, would have had one returning tenure-track U.S. historian next year. One, for a university of 16,000 students. And she's supposed to teach all of American history. So somebody comes along and says to her, why don't you hire a Midwestern historian? She's going to look at you and say, what? I just need somebody who can, I'm a 20th century historian. Is there anybody who can talk about the 18th or 19th century? Now, I don't say that to diminish Midwestern history. What I'm saying is you have to contextualize it in a larger picture in which you're dealing with a profession that is in stress and in serious crisis and is diminishing.
Right. No, I know. We need to obviously recognize. I'm just saying this is, ideally would be a good goal, but I understand the other.
Well, here's your counter argument.
Yeah.
If you had more Midwestern historians in these universities writing about the Midwest, then maybe more legislatures would be receptive to
Yeah,
the
there you
idea.
go.
See?
It's a good argument.
You got to come back with you got to come back with something like that.
Zachary.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I think one thing that in a time of all of this data production, declining enrollments, historians doing colleges and universities doing more gen ed classes because they can't fill their own classes. Challenges with book sales. On the other side of this is something like Ancestry.com, for example, which is going great guns, incredibly profitable. People, many tens upon tens of thousands of people don't think twice about paying $30 a month for a membership, for example. They would think very, very hard about spending $30 on any one of our books. Of course, as they should. They should think very hard because they've got laundry to do and they've got, cat litter to buy and everything else, right? And I don't see that facetious.
No,
I think the difference, why they're willing to do that, and why they are a good run of one of our books at the University Press, maybe 400 copies, in that difference, I think, lies some of this answer. What we are not doing.
I agree.
That they're not willing to pay.
I had to give a talk to a group of Ohio historians about 6 weeks ago. It was called History Without Historians. The notion that Americans aren't interested in history is wrong. There's an enormous amount of interest in history, not just Ancestry.com, but half of what people watch on cable television is historical. Now, it's not, people are watching Wolf Hall, they're watching all this stuff, they're reading David McCullough, there's an enormous amount out there. And when I say history without historians, it's kind of ironic at the same time that the history departments are shrinking, there's this huge appetite for history. I think that's partly our fault. I think we need to think about it. I think the dilemma goes back to Mike Allen's point, which is you have to find some way to communicate with people in ways that resonate with them. And I don't think that's always about technique it's about somehow connecting with them. And that can be on an emotional level. That history is about more, and I've heard a lot of this in great ways in the last 2 days. Joe Amato was really good on that it's about a personal connection somehow within the past. On the other hand, I'm getting old, and I am loath to surrender my professional responsibility, which I believe in, which is I have expertise. I don't know more. I'm not smarter than anybody else, but I've spent 40 years studying the 18th century. Therefore, I think I know probably a little bit more about it than the average person. And there are basic rules. If you're going to do history, You can't make stuff up. And just as important, you can't ignore inconvenient evidence. Rules like that are very important. So while I'm sympathetic to the Ken Burns stuff, I use it, I believe in it, I read. I think David McCullough's a fine historian. I love reading David McCullough biographies. I read all this historical fiction, which I actually find more interesting than the history I read. But I think if we just say, okay, fine, and we stop saying we are a guild that has rules, then we're really, somebody mentioned the word historical integrity back in the back, I think then we're doing something seriously bad.
But there's a point where you can let people see themselves in the story.
Yes.
And it may not necessarily be covering the Battle of Shiloh, where great-great-great-grandfather was, but it may be seeing themselves in the emotion or in the struggle. So if you're the immigrant family or descendants of immigrants, it's incumbent upon us to make immigrant stories interesting, whether they're for Sudanese or Hmong people or what have you. And I think people can resonate with that. Again, it's tough work, but I'm the opposite of the professor turned curator. I'm the curator turned professor, and that's a bloody hard job to do. But it's worth doing.
Nicole? I don't disagree with any of that. It's sort of shocking how, you see these surveys all the time about how little history people know, but I'm all in favor of it. One quick point on the stress that history departments are undergoing and professors, et cetera. One thing that I'm going to go to in about a month is the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature up in East Lansing at Michigan State. It's a great conference, but it opens up an entire other world for people who are interested in Midwestern studies. So you could, given this, dire situation in the academy, begin to pitch this not just as a course in a history department, but you could also offer a course in the English department that covers literature. In the Middle West Review, we try to cover films about the Midwest. You could do a film course. And geography. It's so important. One thing that came up constantly this weekend is the importance of geography. And that's another way to sell this is, in other words, you can check 4 boxes instead of just one little box in a declining history department.
Thank you very much. Let's give him a hand. This has been a great panel. In fact, we've had so much good intellectual content. I think a lot of content to fire the imagination. You've touched on a lot of themes that we at the Hauenstein Center are committed to. This last panel in particular about trying to find a space, create a public space, which is what we're trying to do here for academic intellectuals and public intellectuals. That is so important, and I think that's one way that we can revive interest in whatever your passion is, certainly the Midwest, and I think you're trying to do a whole lot of that, and I applaud you for that. And I saw a lot of possibilities for common ground coming out of this. A lot of human agency is required to put on a big conference, and I want to end this conference with just a couple of remarks about gratitude. We have a lot of people to be grateful for. I want to say first thanks to all the scholars on the current panel and all of you who have presented, the scholars, the journalists, the public intellectuals, the writers, people who have imagination. You're bringing imagination and commitment and passion to this discipline, and I just so appreciate the conversations you've started. Stay tuned because we're going to continue that. I think the Hauenstein Center wants to pursue with you, John, and all of you in here who are interested and committed to this, how do we carry this conversation forward in the future? Let's stay in touch about that. So thank you for all of you who are producing the intellectual and the creative content to keep this conversation going. A lot of people have supported us in this effort in a lot of different ways. I don't just mean taking out a checkbook, although that has certainly been important too. I want first to thank Ralph Hauenstein. Ralph, who was here for 2 of our programs, really enjoyed what he saw, and he told me to tell you thanks on his behalf. But a lot of others have been supportive as well. I think of the Richard and Kate Pugh Walters Foundation, for example, that provided a nice grant for this. The Earhart Foundation out of Ann Arbor that provided a very generous grant for the last 2 days. I think of other people who have supported us. For example, on our advisory cabinet, I'm looking at Marilyn Teich. Hillary Snow was here for just about all the proceedings. A lot of the human capital that goes into supporting what we do, I really appreciate. And of course, we've had a great partnership with Annette Kirk and the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Annette, thank you always for being there for us. We've had a lot of great conversations about these topics. And also, I want to say something about just thank you, gratitude for the staff at the Hauenstein Center. When I think of Kathy Rent and John Howard, and I think of Joe Hogan and Chad Dowding and Ann O'Keefe, all of them worked hard. We had some students join us as well, volunteering, worked hard to make this conference possible. Our gratitude to all of you. Thank you so much for that. Well, as I say, stay tuned. Maybe we ought to use the old Al Jolson. You ain't seen nothing yet. We're going to continue this conversation. Thank you for being a great audience and participants in the first of a great series of conversations about the Midwest. Hey, man. Thanks a lot. This is great. Thanks a lot. We are adjourned. Thank you.